Good evening. I'm Cyrus Taylor, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's my great privilege to welcome you to Amasa Stone Chapel and to Case Western Reserve University. I want to thank you for joining this evening's lecture, which is generously funded by the Cuyahoga County residents through the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture. I'd like to extend a special greeting to our alumni, many of whom have just returned to campus for the upcoming Alumni Weekend. It's a great pleasure to see you here this evening. Over the next 3 days, you'll have a full schedule of exciting events, and I'm delighted that you chose to begin your visit with us tonight. This evening's lecture, sponsored by the Baker-Nord Center for the Humanities, is the keynote address for Humanities Week 2009. In connection with this year's theme, Cultures of Green, Nature and the Environment, the Baker-Nord Center is presenting a rich array of public events, including a Cultures of Green film festival next week at the Cinematheque at the Cleveland Institute of Art. Meanwhile, as part of Alumni Weekend, I want to invite all of you to a panel discussion on sustainability in the university to be held tomorrow afternoon from 4 to 5:30 in the Inamoy Center for Ethics and Excellence on the ground level of Crawford Hall, which is just next door. This event, sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences and the university's newly created Institute for Sustainability, will be hosted by John Rule, Professor of Physics and Institute Director. The panelists will be faculty experts from across the university. I hope you can join us for this informative and exceedingly topical discussion. Finally, I'd like to mention that this evening's lecture is the sort of public event that has brought national recognition to the Baker-Nord Center. Earlier this year, the National Endowment for the Humanities awarded the Center a highly competitive challenge grant in recognition of its superb programs and its success in connecting the university with the larger Cleveland community. We in the college are immensely proud of the center and deeply grateful for the generosity of Jane Nord and her late husband, Eric, whose endowment gift brought the center into being. It's now my great pleasure to present Han Helmreich, Professor of Art History and Director of the Baker-Nord Center for Humanities, who will introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Cyrus. And I want to join Cyrus in thanking you for coming to our keynote lecture. Tomorrow, if you want to join us, we have a flip camera festival as part of our Cultures of Green theme, and that's at 12:30 in the Baker-Nord Center. I, too, also want to thank Cuyahoga Arts and Culture for their support of this event and also for the many benefits they provide our community. I also want to thank the Friends of the Baker-Nord Center for their support, and if you're interested in joining our Friends group, please see myself or any of the other staff members from the center who are here. Just a little housekeeping. Could you all turn off or silence your cell phones? Following the lecture, there'll be time for question and answer, and if possible, use the mics because the sound echoes here. And then there'll be a book signing at the table in the lobby, and 2 of Andrew Light's books are there. And then following the lecture, there's going to be a reception next door at the Anna Mori Center, so if you proceed out this door on this side of the building and across to the lower level of Crawford Hall, you can join us for refreshments and more of an informal opportunity to interact with our speaker. So it's my considerable pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Light, who has an impressive list of affiliations as well as an equally impressive list of publications and contributions. On our Baker-Nord website, we have a resource guide if you want to find out any more about his publications. Dr. Light is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Environmental Policy and Director of the Center for Global Ethics at George Mason University. He's also a Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he coordinates this think tank's participation in the Global Climate Network. The Global Climate Network considers international climate change policy and the future of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Most recently, Dr. Light has been writing about the G20 meeting in Pittsburgh and looking ahead to the UN Copenhagen Convention in December, where the Kyoto Protocols will be revisited. This engagement with these pressing social and political issues comes out of his long-standing interest in environmental policy and ethics, a topic he has explored in over 17 books as author, co-author, and editor. These titles include Environmental Values, Moral and Political Reasoning in Environmental Practice, Technology and the Good Life in Environmental Pragmatism. Dr. Light also co-edits the journal Ethics, Place, and Environment. His practice demonstrates vividly and with passionate commitment how the humanities have a vital contribution to solving the world's problems. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Light.
Can you see the first slide? I can't see from up here. Okay, good. Okay, great. First of all, I want to thank Dean Taylor and Professor Helmrich for inviting me to give this lecture to the Baker Nord Center, to the university, and thanks to the people of Cuyahoga County as well. It's really fantastic to be here, and I'm deeply honored. I know that a lot of very distinguished people have given this lecture before, and I'm humbled to be in their company. I also want to add, also, before I continue, I want to congratulate the Center on the NEH Challenge Grant, which is a true accomplishment. These things are extremely rare. And yes, well done. And I hope that everyone here will join me in wishing them the best and hopefully doing the best to help them meet that challenge, which is going to be difficult, but I have every bit of confidence that they will get there. So the talk tonight is on, obviously, ethics and climate change. And I sort of serve two very distinct roles, one kind of more traditional inside the academy, and one less traditional, especially for a philosopher. And that is that I work in the Center for American Progress, which is a think tank started 6 years ago by John Podesta, who was the last chief of staff for President Clinton. He then started the Center for American Progress as a think tank, not only interested in doing policy formation in Washington, D.C., and trying to influence the electoral process and the Congress and the executive office, but also to be advocates for policies across the spectrum. If you're interested in our work, I'd encourage you to visit our website at www.americanprogress.org. John also played a very significant role in the Obama administration. He was the co-director of the transition team for President Obama, and he took an active role in shaping the agenda of the new administration. CAP has about 200 people, and after the election, we lost 50 to the administration, which was very good news because it meant that a lot of my close friends and my former boss, for example, went into the administration where they lead the executive office on critical issues like climate change. It was bad news in that there was no one left to do any work. So we're in a bit of panic. But we since rebuilt, and we play a kind of a very unique and I think privileged role in the political ecology of Washington, D.C. now, and that we're able to help to shore up and redirect the administration when we think it's necessary. And so it's from that standpoint that I've been doing most of my work in the last year and a half on international climate change, not only doing the scholarly work, but also trying to help to shape the future of the agreements that we face before us. So here's what I want to do tonight. I want to give a very short primer on the latest science on climate change, a refresher for some of you, new information for others. And then I want to talk about the current policy opportunity that we have before us, which I think is probably the most unique policy opportunity when it comes to climate change that humans have ever faced. Things are at a critical stage right now. It makes it very difficult to sort of think about how we're going to move forward, but at the same time, it's a great opportunity for us to move forward and really reshape, in a sense, our relationship not only with each other, but with the planet itself. And then I'm going to end with a couple examples of how I try to do work on ethics in an environment like this, which requires a very different set of skills than I was trained in graduate school, I can assure you. My first 3 or 4 months in the job, I've told people here, I sort of would sit around in conversations at a table and I go, I understand every single word that everyone just said, and I have no idea what we're talking about. And was waiting for that knock on the door, you know, it's been really nice, but sorry, you know. But I persisted, and I think that it shows that a baseline background in the humanities is not something that's restricted to what people might think of conventionally as the job opportunities available for people to get educated in the humanities, that an education in the humanities is a baseline for anything you want to do. And I think at this particular moment in history, when we really need people who are capable of sifting through massive amounts of information on issues like this, which encompass everything from science to policy to politics, it's the critical thinking skills that I gained from my education that have gotten me through to do this job on a daily basis now. Here's where we are in terms of the critical moment we've received in terms of climate change. Two top lines from two of our world's most important scientists. First, Jim Hansen, probably the most important climatologist in the US, former head of the NASA Goddard Center in New York City, and then Rachenda Pachauri, who is head of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the gold star collection of thousands of scientists that we've gone to 4 times since the early 90s to ask them for an assessment of the science of global warming and the potential for mitigating the carbon emissions that we're putting up there and also adapting to the climate change that we're already committed to. Now, scientists, as most of you know, are a reticent group when it comes to talking about policy prescriptions. In fact, it's very important that they not talk about policy prescriptions in most cases. In the Framework Convention, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the world's international body that has produced things like the Kyoto Protocol, of which there's been 14 meetings. The 15th meeting will be in Copenhagen starting on December 7th. The scientists have really been the most important brokers in that entire process because they have stayed neutral on the outcomes, on the policy outcomes. But we reached a certain point where the lack of action, the lack of progress in getting forward and doing something about mitigating humanly caused carbon emissions had reached such an incredible state of if we don't start working now, we really are not going to solve this problem, and then we're going to have to figure out how we're going to adapt to a globe that's going to be very, very different from the one that our species evolved into. That a couple years ago, many of these scientists started speaking out. So here's Jim Hansen in January 2008. We need to reduce from today's atmospheric CO2 about 385 parts per million, a number to represent the aggregate amount of CO2 and CO2-like gases that are in the atmosphere, down to 350 parts per million. He says we are, quote, already too high to maintain the climate to which humanity, wildlife, and the rest of the biosphere are adapted. This target must be pursued on a timescale of decades. Not solved on a timescale of decades, but we have no time to wait to begin this process. And just a couple months before, in December of 2007, during one of the most important in the history of the meetings that the UN has had on climate change, this was a meeting that was held in Bali in 2007, where a roadmap was established for how we were going to get to eventually extending the Kyoto Protocol once it expires in 2012. IPCC Chair Rachenda Pachauri said, what we do in the next 2 or 3 years will define our future. Now here's the kinds of worries that were driving these kinds of statements, which are really unusual for scientists of this caliber. If we continue on the business as usual path that we are doing right now, towards 2100, we're looking at a global rise in temperature of somewhere between 5 to 7 degrees Celsius. And I'll come back to that in a second, to what the world looks like with that kind of temperature rise. That's going to mean a much higher rise at the poles, less at the equator, but a lot of changes in the planet before us. In the run-up to the Copenhagen meeting, where we're going to talk about and hopefully decide a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, the scientific meetings have reached new consensus beyond the findings that they had before. In a March meeting earlier this year, the summary report from the conference was, recent observations confirm the worst case IPCC scenario trajectories are being realized, which is 1,000 parts per million. So remember, Jim Hansen is saying 350 is absolute safety. And now we're looking at 1,000 parts per million. Keep that in mind, and I'll come back to in a second. And this from the IPCC's 4th assessment report. The 4th time we went to the scientists, here was the 4th assessment report. And they talk about what would it mean to stabilize not at 350, but probably safe enough, we're not entirely sure, 450 parts per million. Based on current understanding of climate carbon cycle feedback, stabilizing at 450 parts per million could require emissions over the 21st century to be only 5 gigatons per year. Stabilizing at 1,000 which is not really stability, could require 11, limiting our emissions to 11 gigatons per year. Now, the reason this is disturbing is that current readings show us at already 8.5 gigatons. That's a very critical danger zone. It would be very difficult to pull back from that 8.5 to get to the 5 gigatons a year that we need to get on average in order to get our emissions on a 450 parts per million stabilization path. Now, there's been many criticisms of climate science that it's all based on models. There's a bunch of people, many good friends of mine, at places like the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, which is the premier climate modeling shop in the United States, who say, well, you know, these guys are just running computer models, and computer models can be wrong, and, you know, how do we sort of know this right? We've turned a corner, and this is a point that Jim Hansen makes quite cogently. We've turned a corner where we're no longer talking about just computer models. We're talking about actual observable changes. And this slide represents where we are already ahead of where the models thought we were going to be. So what does the world at business as usual, if we go to 1,000 parts per million, what does that look like? It looks like this. And this slide with these scary sort of upwards spikes in yellow and green and red and stuff like that, this comes from the noted left-wing magazine Fortune. So a bunch of wacky tree huggers, for sure, who sort of read this magazine. Projections of mounting calamities that correlate with that kind of rise in CO2 and temperature. 80 feet of sea level rise, 5 feet rising 10 plus inches per decade by 2100, 1/3 of the planet in extreme drought, and 50% of species lost. Now, I used to think that 2100 was a long way off until last May when my wife and I had our first child. And I was on the phone shortly thereafter with a colleague in Japan, and we were talking, and we were going over some sort of projections and figures and things that I needed to know to help to prepare my boss, John Podesta, for some testimony he was going to be giving before the Senate. And I had an aside, and I said, well, you know, 2100, that's still a long, we've still got a lot of time. And he said, well, Andrew, you realize, you know, your son in 2100 will be 91 years old if he survives to live that age. And with medical technology the way it's going, that's probably 90s are going to be the new 60s by then, so 120, 130. So when he's probably still leading a very active life, I hope, he may not live in a planet where he'd want to live in a very active life. And that really, really crystallized where we think. We're not talking about abstract obligations to future generations that we'll never meet. We're talking about the people we're sharing the planet with right now. And I think that crystallizes things. Now we know that just a few things on the impacts and what we're looking at here. This is a slide that shows hurricane tracks. I'm not sure how clearly that's showing up, but the upper left-hand corner actually is an outline of the Gulf Coast of the United States. And this shows hurricanes tracks from 1985 to 1984 as they move through the Gulf of Mexico. The thicker part of the line is, of course, where the hurricanes were more intense. The thinner part of the line is where they're less intense. That's 85 to 94, and here's 95 to 2005. Now, there is a lot, I'm not going to make a strong claim that there's a direct causal relation between CO2 temperature rises and hurricane intensity and strength, but there certainly are strong correlations, and the science is pretty clear that as the oceans heat up, then you get more and more likelihood of intense weather events of these sort. The science after Katrina, for example, focused a lot on this. And what we're learning now, which I find even a little bit more disturbing, is that the models that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was using to predict impacts of climate change from their fourth assessment report turn out to be probably very conservative, which actually makes quite sense because the IPCC produces a report for which the executive summary has to be agreed to by the 192 nations who sponsor it. So this is a very conservative bit of science. And if you look at some of the findings since the IPCC reduced their report on observed sea level rise, polar ice sheets, impacts on boreal forests, you find that, in fact, things are happening a lot faster than any of those models predicted. A couple things on here, faster changes in terms of Arctic sea ice. The red line indicates where we actually are in terms of loss of sea ice. The black line were the models. And then in terms of sea level rise. On the red line, you got the IPCC scenarios and the range of uncertainty in the red bars, the red shaded area around the line, and then you sort of see what the actual satellite measurements are giving us. So we are moving quite rapidly into a world that potentially, certainly not one that I want my son to grow into, and I'm sure you wouldn't want your children or grandchildren either. Good news is I think we have a kind of a perfect storm of opportunity now, which gives me hope. And I am quite optimistic about our ability to deal with this problem and to mobilize the resources that we need to, both in the United States and internationally, to deal with this problem. The first storm is the UN climate change talk. So as Anne said, the Copenhagen meeting, the next meeting of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, starts in December. 2 years ago in Bali is when we set that as the deadline for when we have to decide on a successor to the Kyoto Protocol, which expires in 2012. Now that gives us 2 years from this meeting until the end of 2012 to get the work done in terms of coming up with a successor to the Kyoto Protocol. That's cutting in half the amount of time it took to form the Kyoto Protocol, which was 4 years. And so really we've accelerated quite a lot. There are two negotiating tracks, and I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk, but just keep them in mind right now. And that is that have been talked about in the Kyoto Protocol, or that are being negotiated as we speak. One is called the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Future of the Kyoto Protocol. So in 2012, when the KP expires, do we just sort of try to revise it, revisit it, and move on to something else? And make it better and reauthorize it? Or do we do another treaty entirely? And that's the track on what's called long-term cooperative action. Now, the Kyoto Protocol, the position of the United States, and it's a position that I share, is a very, very flawed document. It's flawed principally because it divides the world into 2 buckets of countries. The developed countries, which are referred to as the Annex I countries, and the developing countries, which are referred to as the non-Annex I countries. So the developed countries are the countries that are essentially represented in organizations like the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So the US, the EU, Japan, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. The non-Annex I countries include the rest of the world, but unfortunately also include some of the biggest emitters in the world in terms of carbon emissions. And most importantly, I'm referring there to 6 countries: China, India, Indonesia, Brazil, South Africa, and Mexico. Now I'll come back later to what was the rationale and what was the reasoning behind dividing the world up between one big group of countries and another big group of countries. But essentially, the primary political argument that was waged by the United States Senate for why the US would never join the Kyoto Protocol was focused on this dividing the world up between the developed and the developing countries. And so in 1994, the Byrd-Hagel resolution was passed before the ink was even dry on the Kyoto Protocol. And so Al Gore, as you might expect, was heavily involved in the negotiation of that treaty. And before he could even bring the treaty back to the Senate voted 94-0. Actually, it was 98-0, not against the Kyoto Protocol, but it was worse than that. They said, don't even bother. Don't even bother to bring it to us. We won't even consider it. And what the marker they laid down was, we will not consider a treaty that requires the United States to curb its carbon emissions if it does not also require these major emitters in the developing world, and they stipulated especially India and China, to also try to achieve some kind of reductions in emissions. The Senate, especially looking at the rapidly accumulating, and they were right on this, amount of US debt that China was getting by that time, said we're not going to sign into something that could potentially weaken American competitiveness, so they refused to go there. So when the Obama administration started negotiating for us after the inauguration last January, they put most of their eggs into the idea of creating an alternative language, a new treaty entirely that would have a more fine-grained set of buckets of how you would divide up the world and divide up the world's responsibilities. They based this on the science, not on the politics. The IPCC, the scientists I referred to earlier, tell us that the global goal to get to safety, to get to that 450 parts per million stabilization path, is that we have to cut emissions in half globally by the year 2050. That's where we need to go. And it's cut them in half globally by 2050 relative to what the emissions were in 1990. Their claim is that the contribution of developed countries, so countries like ours, to that global goal should be that we should eventually aim to decrease our emissions 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. The bill that was passed in the House last June is aimed to meet that 2050 goal. The problem is, though, and this isn't a question of politics and economics that the Byrd-Hagel resolution was aimed at, but the problem is that you can't get to cutting in half global emissions by 2050 if only the developed countries make that 80% contribution. It doesn't add up because emissions are rising so rapidly. The US used to be the top emitter in the world. We're still the top per capita emitter in the world, but now China is the top emitter in the world. And when India surpasses China in population, which it will eventually do, then it might surpass even China in terms of emissions. So that kind of emissions path can't go on unabated to get to where we need to be by 2050. So we need to come up with some way of enticing these countries like China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico to eventually join the developed world in lowering their emissions so we can eventually get to safety. And that's the science and the physics talking. That is not politics. Storm 2. Before you can land that plane, right, of Copenhagen and get to a new international agreement, there's another plane you got to land beforehand, and that's the US Congress. And that's not a plane that functions very well. Now, the problem, of course, is that the US has not been at the table for the last 8 years to try to work on negotiating a new treaty, a new international climate treaty. It's not just in the lap of the Bush administration. Clearly, the failure of the Clinton administration to get a single vote in the Senate to even consider looking at the Kyoto Protocol is a pretty big mark of failure for them to do their job in terms of preparing the world for doing something on getting an international treaty on climate change. So starting last January, it was a mad dash to try to get a bill through the House and through the Senate, a comprehensive bill on climate and energy, so that we would be prepared to go to Copenhagen in December and put our cards on the table. What are we willing to do in terms of decreasing emissions? Because in order to get countries like China and India to commit to some kind of emissions reductions, you've got to tell them what we're willing to do. Because just like the Senate wasn't willing to put the US at jeopardy to China and India if they were going to do nothing, China and India are not going to put themselves at jeopardy trade-wise with respect to us unless we're willing to put something on the table. It makes complete sense. To put something on the table, the first option, the preferred option, is that Congress act, they produce a bill, they put it on the desk of the president, and then he signs it or he vetoes it. Now, in addition to working on something as complicated as comprehensive climate and energy policy, Obama, of course, as you know, had other things on the agenda as well. You know, nothing major, completely reforming America's healthcare system, dealing with 2 wars, and a couple minor other things, right? So the legislative calendar has been packed, and it's been very, very difficult for us to basically move this mountain, which is the US Congress, to get this bill through so that Obama will be able to negotiate in Copenhagen. Where are we now? Well, we passed a bill in the House, and I'm happy to talk to you later about any particular provisions of the House legislation, the Waxman-Markey legislation. It's called the American Clean Energy and Security Act, which includes a cap-and-trade system, and a number of other measures to decrease emissions, including money to decrease emissions from tropical forestry, new renewable electricity standards, new appliance standards, and a number of other provisions which would measurably decrease our emissions. And like I said, according to the analysis of the bill, eventually get us to where we need to be by 2050 to make our contribution of cutting our emissions by 80%. Next up is the Senate. 2 weeks ago, Barbara Boxer from California and John Kerry from Massachusetts introduced a companion bill to the House bill. It is different than the House bill in a number of important respects. They start their hearings on this bill on next Tuesday, and today John Kerry announced that he was going to move to have this bill through all the committees it needed to get through by Thanksgiving. So they've set quite an agenda for themselves. And the question on everyone's mind, and I'll wait until question and answer to answer it, is will they finish, number one? And if they don't finish, then what happens in Copenhagen? And those are exactly the right questions to answer. Now, the fight for this second storm that's brewing is going to be, in some parts, in some ways, very similar to the House fight, in some ways different. The House fight was really about the battle of the economic models. So, you know, my organization produces economic models about what a cap-and-trade system of the sort envisioned in Waxman-Markey would cost you in terms of your average energy bills in your households over a year. And then across town, other organizations, which I won't name, came up with models that said that it would cost you more. We also modeled out job growth. So how much in terms of if we do this massive project, essentially of moving off of carbon as the fundamental driver of our economy to renewable sources, what would we get in terms of job creation? And we argue that the Waxman-Markey bill plus the stimulus package that was passed last January, which has $140 billion worth of clean energy provisions, would net out 1.7 million jobs across town. Others said it would destroy 2 million jobs. Now there's a big gap between those two figures, right? But that was basically the state of the debate. Your economic model versus my economic model. We go in, we clash over this stuff, and then we sort of see who comes out on the top in the end. And essentially, the House passed the bill with 1 vote. Now, we're going to see that again in the Senate bill. The first thing that Senator Boxer did when she produced her bill was submit it to the Environmental Protection Agency to run a cost analysis on it. And she said, we will not hold a single hearing on this bill until the EPA finishes running a cost analysis on this bill. And so that's what we're waiting to see, and it may happen as early as tomorrow, that will be released. But secondly, remember the history of the Byrd-Hagel Amendment, the first time the Senate thought about whether or not the U.S. would sign on to an international climate change bill, and they said no. China is at the top of the minds of the senators who are paying the closest attention to this legislation. They want to know a couple things. Will China eventually follow us? So that goes back to the last slide in sort of thinking about the future of the Kyoto Treaty. Will China follow us? Will they put a price on carbon in a similar way that we are planning on putting a price on carbon, and then equalize the trade playing field? They're also worried about the impacts. The sad truth is that if all of the developed countries of the world today just turned off the taps, so I happen to know you've got a coal-fired plant here on Case Western's campus that provides heat, so you just shut it off tomorrow, along with all the other coal plants in the region that provide Ohio with power, shut them all off, turn them down to 0. And if China continued on a business-as-usual path, then we would still eventually hit those marks of 1,000 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. So we have to have a deal that is good enough to entice China into it. And that's going to require, and I'll come back to this at the end, not only putting our cards on the table in terms of what we're willing to do in terms of reducing our emissions, but also putting our cards on the table in what we're doing to help the rest of the world to follow us on a low-carbon pathway. And that was enshrined in an agreement that the Bush administration actually made 2 years ago. So those are the things that need to be talked about. Those are provisions that are covered in both of those bills. And the road through the Senate is definitely going to be harder than the road through the House for various reasons, but that's where we are. Now, given that so much of this fight is about competitiveness with other countries and the economy, then the third storm is, of course, this one. It's very, very difficult to do this when everyone's worried about the future of the economy, not only nationally, but globally. Now, we're seeing signs that, of course, we're getting some improvement of that the stimulus bill may have worked, and that we're making some inroads. But they're certainly not uniform. And so it's difficult to make this argument at this time. On the other hand, this has been a key part of the argument for those of us interested in seeing a new climate bill, is that it's that Rahm Emanuel, who is, as you know, Chief of Staff to Barack Obama, says you never let a crisis go to waste, right? He says it more colorfully than that, actually. But the point is this, is that it's at these times, especially when you're looking at the history of American economic cycles, and you figure, like, the idea that when you get a big downturn, walking away from it and letting all the firms kind of sink that are going to sink is probably not the best thing to do. It's then when we now, sort of the conventional wisdom now, is that we start trying to spend our way out of these recessions. And the argument, the modeling is that this is one of the best ways to spend our way out of that, because it gets you a win-win. It gets you money into the economy to get people employed, and it gets us towards that pathway of lowering our emissions, which eventually will entice other countries to lower their emissions, which will then hopefully solve this problem. The incredible thing that I've witnessed, having worked on climate change for most of my adult life, is the incredible change that we've seen the Obama administration make in a very, very, very short amount of time. I won't go through all of these, but my colleague Joe Rome, who's the former Assistant Secretary for Energy, for Renewable Energy under the Clinton administration, who follows this stuff sort of better than anyone on one of our blogs at CAP called Climate Progress, he said that in a month and a half, the first month and a half out of the gate, the Obama administration did more that had been done on climate change in the past 8 years. I would correct him and say it's really more like the past 12 years. And over and over and over again, not only have we moved to do things like spend money to create green jobs in places like this, to get the low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency, retrofitting houses, all that thing, and then also move to stimulating the parts of the economy that are going to be moving into renewable energy, but we've also been clearly signaling to our allies that we find this issue to be just as important as they do. And that was critically important to making the steps, which are showing some progress in terms of getting China at the table. And most recently, this week, India has started to change its tune and also talk about things it's willing to do in terms of moving forward. And probably most importantly, and maybe least appreciated, is that the Obama administration has started working on a Plan B. So part of my answer to the question of what happens if the Senate fails is that the administration has made a lot of strides towards working out a solution of how the executive office can regulate CO2 emissions if the Congress does not deliver a bill. Because as you know, the House delivers its bill, the Senate will have to deliver a companion bill. There are going to be differences between the two. They then go into reconciliation, right, where they have to figure out, to come up with one bill that represents both sides and they have to make it all the same. That will then go back to both houses, be voted on again, and then eventually hopefully go to the president's desk. If that process doesn't happen, which involves a lot more steps than where we are right now, then the Obama administration has begun to sort of think about what can be done under the executive office of the president. And the story here goes back 3 years ago when Massachusetts and 11 other states sued the Environmental Protection Agency over their failure to decide whether or not CO2 and carbon emissions were an endangerment to human health and the environment. So our two most important pieces of environmental legislation in the United States are the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. When the EPA decides that a contaminant, either an air contaminant or a water contaminant, is a threat to human health and the environment at particular levels, those then become enshrined within the architecture of the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act, and then the administration has no choice. They are bound by law to try to regulate and decrease those emissions. We can all sue them if they don't do their job. That's the way those acts are set up. And so these 12 states took the EPA to court because they'd petitioned them to try to determine whether or not CO2 should be regulated as a greenhouse gas, which I will remind you was in fact a campaign promise that George Bush made in the 2000 election. Just as a little aside, it's kind of an interesting thing here. If you, like me, remember the debates between Al Gore and George Bush, climate change didn't come up once in any of the debates between Al Gore and George Bush. Kind of curious, because one of the guys there on the platform had written a whole book on the subject and, got the first hearings both in the House and the Senate on climate change. It didn't come up once. And the reason it didn't come up is because George Bush did actually promise to regulate CO2 under the auspices of the Clean Air Act. He rolled that back 5 months after he was inaugurated, and they didn't do it. States petitioned, and then the EPA didn't do it, so they sued in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, said the EPA must make a determination of whether or not CO2 is an endangerment. The Bush administration then sat on that decision for 2 years, passed it off to the next administration. As we know, that's Obama's administration. And in April of this past April, the administration ordered the EPA to begin the process of deciding whether or not CO2 is an endangerment. They will release those findings very, very shortly. There were something like 4,000 comments submitted in the public commentary period, including all manner of charges that, in fact, that the EPA should, and this is a quote, should have a Scopes monkey trial on the science of climate change to determine how to go forward. I don't think the people who proposed that knew the legacy of the Scopes monkey trial actually is not really the best way to put that claim. And the point is, though, is that when the EPA delivers their decision, the administration will have a stick that they can use to threaten the Congress to get the act done, and if not, a very crude tool, but nonetheless a tool to limit carbon emissions. And there's a lot of debate about what they can do with the Clean Air Act when it comes to emissions, but at least that gives the president enough, if the Congress fails entirely, to go to Copenhagen and say, here's what I think I can deliver in terms of reductions in emissions. Okay. two examples of climate ethics, and I know that a lot of this talk so far is probably certainly not solely within the purview of philosophy or ethics. But that's the kind of things that you need to know and need to work on in order to bring the tools of philosophy to this discussion if you want to actually influence the people who are making the decisions, if you want to have a seat at the table. And that's critically important. And I take I'll come back to this in a second. I think that there are ethicists who have sort of learned this lesson, have learned it quite well. And I think that that's the direction that environmental ethics needs to go. And that's always sort of been my view and my vision for the field. And so when I got into climate change, as opposed to the other issues I was working on, I kind of made a decision that the kind of contribution I wanted to make was a decision on the policy process and not just on my colleagues in philosophy departments. So the reason I say that, and I'll sort of keep this pretty quickly, is that if I were to sort of give you a lecture on the history of environmental ethics, which is a very young field compared to most fields of philosophy, it really goes back to the early 1970s. It's had about 30 years out there. And partly because, for various reasons, because I think people who started doing philosophy about the environment, since not very many philosophers had to do that, they thought that to really prove the legitimacy of the field, they needed to prove that they were really, really good theoreticians, right? And that's what they did. And they launched a whole array of arguments about why economic value is not the sole value that ought to be considered in environmental decision-making. And it was really focused on the question of whether or not we have direct obligations to nature, because nature has a kind of value maybe similar to the kinds of values that we attribute to humans. I'm not sure if this is one of the books you have back there, but if it is, and you buy it, then you could read it, and you can sort of see that I and my colleagues who have worked on this sort of line have come up with arguments that we think that this kind of approach, and we can talk about it later, is not very sound philosophically for various reasons, but more importantly, it seems to be practically unhelpful if that's where you stop. If you just sort of say, full stop, I've done the theory, bye-bye, I've made my contribution. And the reason is because to isolate values in nature as separate from the way we value other needs that humans have, and to keep those in separate buckets really doesn't help us very much in the policy process. Because when we make decisions about preserving nature, when we make these big decisions about doing things like completely transforming the American economy, we absolutely have to balance those moves against the other needs that people have. And that's critically important not only in places like the United States, but even more so in countries in the developing world, where they are not only are going to be asked to reduce their emissions, but are also trying to do a lot to pull their own people out of poverty at the same time. So it's a balancing act that's very critical. And the idea is, I think, that we need not only a philosophical theory that can do that, but a philosophical practice that can do it as well. So the question I started asking myself is how is it that ethicists could respond immediately to these kinds of questions in real time? Now, the first example I'll give you is a kind of the background approach that I took that sort of guided me into this work. When I look around at the array of philosophers who work on various kinds of ethical problems, the ones, and this is somewhat controversial, but I would sort of stick to it, and I think I can defend it, the ones that I think have actually been the most successful in not only communicating outside of their own discipline, outside of the communities of their own colleagues, but have also been able to have a real impact on folks like us, people in the world, it's clinical bioethics. Now, it's sad but true that if you don't work at a university, the one philosopher or philosophically trained practitioner you might meet in your life is going to be a clinical bioethicist. And this is someone who's going to help you to make a very, very difficult decision that you may have to make about, for example, whether or not you terminate the life support of a loved one who hasn't left directives on what they want to be done for extreme measures. And so your hospital and every other teaching hospital in the country, and in fact every other major hospital in the country now, has staff bioethicists who do that, because the law, as we know, only goes so far in terms of giving you advice on what to do. And so what happens when a decision like this has to be made is the ethicist comes in and they talk to you. And they give you advice, right, where the law does not direct you on whether or not you should turn off the life support. Now, the thing that they don't do is they don't come in and say, there was this guy in the 18th century named Immanuel Kant, and he had this great ethical theory. Here it is. Now, I think if you take Kant's advice and you have to make this decision, here's what it should be. And we knew that would just be an absurd way of making this decision. That's not to say they're not influenced and learn it in the history of philosophy, but that's not how you communicate the decision. What you do is you walk into someone's office, and I've been on grand rounds with a number of clinical bioethicists to kind of learn this technique. You go in and you talk to people about what they value, what is important to them, what do they think are the qualities of a good life, and then you ask them questions about what do you think was important to the person you're making the decision for. And then you try to come up with the best advice that you can give them. There are better and worse decisions that we can make in those contexts, but they have to be informed by the values that people already have, not the ones they would get from, say, taking a graduate course in philosophy. And it makes complete sense. So in terms of thinking about how I was to do my work, what I thought is we need a kind of a climate ethics that's able to do a similar sort of thing. Offer people practical advice, though informed by our sense of what are the better and worse outcomes that can happen in a moral sense. Now, the problem, of course, is that when you're trying to do something like climate ethics, you don't just need the opinion of one person making a decision for one other person, or a couple people, a family making a decision for one other person. You need to understand what everybody thinks. What are the moral values that everybody has on questions like this? So that led me into the literature of social science polling. And that's very important, because there are different kinds of polls that try to come up with answers for how it is that people value things. Now, before getting to the good ones, let me give you a bad one. This is a poll from the Pew Research Center on the People of the Press made last January. This is an annual poll that the Pew does on top legislative priorities for people. There's about 15 or 20 of them there, and they range from everything to terrorism, social security, education, energy, Medicare, healthcare, deficit reduction, moral decline, military, tax cuts, environment, the whole gambit. And on just about every one of these annual polls, will be another one that will come up in January, the global warming sinks to the bottom as a priority. And this is often taken as very disturbing, and then reporters will write stories that will wind up on the front page that say Americans don't care about global warming. And unfortunately, a poll like this is actually this is the kind of information that a lot of members of Congress will take as just the truth, especially if they don't hear from their constituents about what they really care about. Now, the problem with a survey like this is it is an example of a fallacy that pollsters and social scientists who work in this area call the finite pool of worry. And this is a really, really, I think, valuable lesson. And the idea is very simple. Many of the best ideas are simple. And it's that people can't worry about everything all of the time, So I take my 5-month son every morning. I get on the metro in DC, and I take him about 5 stops down to his daycare center, which is right across the street from the old executive office building next to the White House. And I love it, right? Because it's like I strap him on, kind of walk down the street, and he's kind of enjoying things, sort of, when I am not harried, as we all know, this is not always easy. And I get on there and I kind of love the experience of being on the metro and, and sort of that stuff. And I start thinking about my day, and I pull up my BlackBerry and I pull up a couple messages, and sort of start thinking about what I'm going to do, and did I have my coffee yet, and all this kind of stuff. So I got stuff in my head, and they're in some kind of ranking about what I'm going to do. And then usually, inevitably, at least once a week, about 3 stops in, I go, swine flu, right? Because I'm underground, surrounded by hundreds of other people with a 5-month-old, during a potential pandemic, right? Exposing my son, I feel like a terrible father, and then I just, want to cry. And the thing is, of course, that is a worry that I should have and balance it on some ways, but if I were to you made me rank things at that particular moment in my life, swine flu would probably be down there at the bottom, even though maybe statistically I should worry more about it. So if there are doctors who think that I should worry a lot more about it, then you maybe can tell me afterwards. Now, the thing of this is that the same is going to be true. If you give someone, especially people who don't follow Roll Call or The Hill or one of the congressional dailies that tracks exhaustively every single legislative debate going on in the US Congress, they're not going to really, when confronted, you need to just now rank this list, 1,503 people, and then we're going to take this as a finding. That's probably not a very good finding. That was the suspicion. Some researchers, some colleagues of mine at George Mason, along with the Yale Center for Climate Change, actually did a study assuming that there was more to the story on climate change, and they came up with some extremely important and interesting results. So from their work that was completed in this past year. This first report is called Climate Change in the American Mind. They did another study with the same data, and I can direct you to where you can find it, called Climate Change, the Six Americas, where they divide the American populace into 6 distinct groups on climate change, from the alarmed all the way to the skeptical and dismissive. But when you ask people, and I don't know if this is going to be clear enough over there, about potential outcomes to reduce global warming, and you're just talking to them about global warming and not talking about a list of 20 other legislative priorities, then it turns out that, in fact, most people, and the blue bars represent good things they think will happen if you do something about global warming. The brown bars represent things that they don't like that would happen if you do something about global warming. And so at the top, 66% of people say it provides a better life for our children and our grandchildren. And then 65% save many plants and animal species from extinction. Down to the bottom of that first group of blue lines, 48% say protect God's creation. And then you get down into some of the negatives: lead to more government regulation, interfere with the free market, harm people, poor people more than it harms them, undermine American sovereignty, down there towards the bottom. This is the kind of thing that I think is informative for doing a kind of a clinical climate ethics, because it gives you a snapshot, right, into what people are thinking. It's like that conversation you have in the hospital room with people. It gives you something to think about in terms of what are the values that are important to them when they are thinking about an environmental problem like climate change. And with more research funding that we've applied for from the National Science Foundation, we're going to try to dig even deeper into these numbers and try to figure out in a more fine-grained way, what does it mean when someone says something like, for example, we should do something about climate change because it protects God's creation? Are they talking about an ethics of stewardship? Are they talking about a divine right command that they think that there is for humans to protect the planet? What exactly do they mean? And then what should that tell us in terms of the different kinds of valid, right, and true arguments that can be made for why we should do something about this issue? One final example, and we'll stop. And this is an example which is about the fundamental moral dilemmas. So it's one thing to sort of understand what people are thinking about climate change, but that's not enough to actually get into, that's a forum for doing something like moving the US Congress. But then there's this other forum, which is moving a community of nations. And that's not about appealing to constituents in a particular nation. That's about dealing with the politics of the last 15 years about trying to deal with climate change and then moving beyond some of the dilemmas of it. So here are what I would argue are the moral foundations of the UN climate process. 3 really key things that have always been discussed in this process. The first one is enshrined in the original language of the Kyoto Protocol, and it says that different nations will take common but differentiated responsibilities. So the idea here was, for 2 reasons, it should not be the case that every country in the world should make the same contribution to limit carbon emissions as every other country in the world. And the reason is because of the nature of the substance of carbon. It persists in the atmosphere for a long time, depending on the source. The carbon emissions that are in the atmosphere now that are causing the problem of global warming are emissions that the developed countries put there. That's the emissions that we burned in order to achieve our industrial revolutions. Even though China is now the largest emitter, its share of the emissions that are up there now is actually comparatively much smaller than what the United States is. On top of that is this thing I mentioned before. Countries like China and India are simultaneously developed and developing countries. They have modern cities, they have big transportation infrastructures, they also have millions of people in abject poverty who are suffering from infant mortality rates that are much higher than ours, malnutrition, shortened life expectancy, all these sorts of things. And so the idea from the beginning of this whole process for why developed countries would have to bear more of a burden, at least initially, in reducing carbon emissions is because of the differences in our emissions profile and our different development needs. 2 years ago, partly looking forward to what we're going to be doing in Copenhagen, which requires pulling some of those countries into the decision, those developing countries into the decision to begin to reduce their emissions, a new kind of language sprung into place in this process, and it was called nationally appropriate mitigation actions. So the idea is that, in fact, more countries than just the developed countries should eventually take on emissions reductions of their own, either under the Kyoto Protocol or under something else, and they would do so in exchange for 2 things. Help with technology to get there, because they didn't want to pay us a lot of money for clean energy technology and make us rich while they transferred their economy for pretty much the same principles that underlie the first one. And then secondly, help with financing, especially for the poorest countries that are already experiencing global warming right now. They're already seeing sea level rise, all those things on the last final charts in the science section that I told you. And then enshrining the entire thing is that we need to keep in mind our moral obligations to human future generations. And that's where we are in terms of the moral framework there. Now the problem is that 45 days away from Copenhagen, even with these very good and interesting principles that ought to get us some kind of progress, we're not doing very well at all. So 6 months before each of these big UN meetings, there's these smaller monthly meetings with the Sherpas, with the actual climate negotiators, people like my former colleague Todd Stern from the Center for American Progress, who's now the US special envoy for climate change in the State Department. And in those monthly meetings, they try to sort of work out some kind of deal to try to get to further along in terms of a Copenhagen Treaty. The last round of these ended in Bangkok just a couple of weeks ago. And it was probably one of the most depressing meetings that I ever witnessed in 8 years of being involved in this process. Because remember I told you there are these two tracks. There's the Kyoto Protocol track on the one hand, the group of negotiators who are saying, can we refine the Kyoto Protocol and extend it beyond 2012? There's the other track that the US is mostly involved in, the track that's trying to come up with alternative language for a new treaty. Now 2 years ago, we decided that it was okay to have both those tracks, and we could talk about alternatives from the Kyoto Protocol, and the United States, along with many other countries, including Australia, Norway, and Costa Rica, submitted a lot of new language for an alternative treaty other than the Kyoto Protocol. At the end of those meetings in Bangkok, the head of the main block of countries that represent the developing world, which is called the G77, which is actually 130 nations, and that's chaired right now by the Sudanese government. They ended the whole meeting with this quote: "Feelings are running high in the G77. It is clear now that the rich countries want to deal outside the Kyoto Agreement. This is an alarming development. The intention of developed countries is clearly to kill the protocol." Now you know things are bad basically when people are lying about things. And this is a complete misrepresentation. Obviously, if we've been negotiating a second track on a new treaty for the last 2 years, and countries other than the United States have been proposing this, then to suddenly sort of say that the US has out of nowhere produced new language for a treaty is just to completely mislead the media and also people in different countries about that. And it's not a hard thing to do to mislead the media on these things, because frankly a lot of the reporters who cover this kind of story don't really know the details, history of the negotiations around that. So together with the United Nations Foundation, sort of seeing that this was brewing, we could sort of see this coming like actually back in August, we started working on, is there a way that you could represent not a kind of an alternative future in which everyone did not everything, wouldn't transform their entire economy, but do just enough to get us to where we needed to go along the pathway to reducing emissions, to getting to safety, inside, without sort of relying on, hopefully not bringing up these tensions of developed versus developing countries in this old, terrible sort of language that has dominated this system of negotiation. So we produced a report called Meeting the Climate Challenge together with our colleagues in the United Nations Foundation, led by former Senator Tim Wirth from Colorado. And we modeled out 3 different policies. And this will just take a second to run out for you and I'll stop. We modeled out 3 different policies. We said, what would happen if the 21 biggest emitters in the world, without breaking them down in developed and developing countries, were to do 3 policies, which in fact most of these countries are already moving towards. China's moving in this direction, the US, if it passes, the current legislation is moving to this direction. If they did 3 very simple things. If first of all, they increased their renewable energy portfolios to 20%. So we go from the current portfolio of mixture of carbon-based fuel sources and non-carbon-based fuel sources, renewable fuel sources, and we all adopted a 20% standard, so we all try to get to 20% of renewable energy by 2020. Number 2, we all commit ourselves to reducing forest emissions by half by 2020 as well. And this is a completely feasible project. Already Brazil has set up an Amazon fund which could easily sort of enact and achieve these kinds of results. And number 3, and this turns out to be the most important, currently these 21 countries average improving energy efficiency about 1.25% per year. We said, could you take that to 2% a year? Which is a lot of, that's one of the key goals that was embodied in our stimulus package that was passed last January. Can you take that to 2% per year by 2015? Where would you get? And the way to read this chart is what you would get to is essentially getting to 75% of the emission cuts that you would want to get to by 2020 to get on that stabilization path to 450 parts per million, and which is what the scientists sort of say is probably the safety zone that we need to be trying to meet. And then we ran cost numbers on it, and this was the shock on all this. What's the cost in doing this? Well, in terms of billions of US dollars per year for those 21 countries to do that, renewable energy getting to 20% would cost $34 billion a year. Getting to that cutting in half tropical forestry emissions by 2020 would cost you $51 billion per year. But the efficiency gains alone pay for the entire thing. And it nets you, at the end of the day, $14 billion, which you can use for healthcare and other things like that. And that's the kind of thinking we're using in organizations like mine to try to break through these deadlocks, to preserve the moral foundations of the original spirit of why we're involved in these negotiations in the first place, and also prove that we can do this in a way that doesn't destroy the economy, that in fact probably promotes a new kind of sustainable economic growth. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Well, I've been on the fence about whether to buy a new refrigerator or not. So it came at the house. I thought I could get one of 50, so I may have just tipped over. But other than refrigeration recommendations, I'm sure you have much more serious things. Questions from people. The bills are in the progress. I see a hand. You know, it'd probably be great if you could really come up to the mic. Yeah? Because the sound just echoes here. Thank you.
Hi. Question on the last slide that you projected, the forest and land use way of reducing emissions. Could you elaborate on that? Because I'm familiar with the renewable energy and the energy conservation.
Could I elaborate on the forestry use and
right,
what that would entail?
Right.
Yeah.
Like, is that limiting?
I'll be happy to send you a copy of the report.
Sure.
It's more than so. One thing to sort of like, if you look at sort of some of the win-wins involved in dealing with this problem, and sort of one of them clearly is like the idea that you sort of put people to work by moving to a clean energy economy. That's argued as a win-win. That was a big part of the argument to get the House bill through. Forestry is probably the other extremely clear win-win. So globally, the emissions from loss of just tropical forest account to 17% of carbon emissions worldwide. And because you're losing a bunch of you're losing two things, right? You sort of get the emissions that you get from the burning of forests, you also are losing the sequestration potential of those trees that are now gone. And 17% is the entire global transportation sector. It's every car, it's every bus, it's every moped, it's every diesel-powered skateboard, right? All of it. And so that's what a big and significant section that is, and it's underappreciated because, in fact, the cost of stopping deforestation per ton of carbon that you save there is much, much lower than, say, building a giant wind farm or building, new technology to sequester the carbon off of a coal-fired power plant and sink it into the ground, carbon capture and sequestration technology. So what we modeled out there, and the details are in the report, were not only the avoided deforestation, but we also looked at land use across the board. So this involves also an ambitious proposal for restoration, for regrowing the forest that we've lost, and also changes to modeled out different kinds of changes to agricultural land use as well, moving to low-till to no-till, those kinds of things, and the sequestration potential that might be involved there. So that was sort of basically the intuition behind it.
Thanks.
I had a question on policy. I wrote this down if you don't mind. What's the opposition to climate control legislation, including the rejection of Kyoto?
I'm sorry, this room does swallow the sound, and even with the mic, you need to speak up a little bit.
Can you hear me now? I'm sorry.
Yep.
Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Much of the opposition to climate control legislation, including the rejection of Kyoto, is from concerns of comparative economic disadvantage between countries that implement the controls and those that don't. And this has strategic like defensive implications. And this reminded me of like the arms control movement during the Cold War. I was curious if any policy has been suggested to model carbon control negotiations off of the arms control movement, meaning that basically instead of having the entire United Nations try to work out a treaty, have limited multilateral or bilateral treaties among strategic competitors that would involve like small changes and then reciprocity and perhaps pulling out of it if the other party reneges.
Right. Thank you. In fact, I strongly agree with you, the sentiment behind that question. The UN Framework Convention process is an incredibly difficult process. And this is a very important ethical point as well, is that it defers greatly to a kind of a procedural justice model, right? That you must have a completely transparent and fair and open procedure in order to get any countries to negotiate for something as big as this. And it includes things like, every single one of those 192 countries, depending on the question, has a veto. Now that's incredibly difficult. We think it's hard to get 60 votes in the Senate. You try getting 192 votes out of 192 votes, right, in the UN. And that makes things very difficult. Now, it's also very important because, even the smallest countries for whom their emissions don't really matter that much in the grand scheme of things, they have a lot at stake. There's an organization called AOSIS, which is the Organization of Small Island States, includes countries like the Maldives, who are sinking, who are going to they're going to be the first ones to go down. And so even though we all know that the two most important players in this whole thing are China and the United States because of their emissions profile and what it could be, what could happen if they don't cooperate, what they do, right, is going to make a big impact on small countries like that. Now, the one sort of thing that we have to keep in mind, and this is, you can sort of see this in this study we did with the United Nations Foundations, you actually don't need 192 countries to really make a big dent in this problem. In fact, you probably really, to get to where we need to go by 2050, you need cooperation of only about, something that represents only about 80% of the emissions on the globe, and that's about 17 countries, including the UN, negotiating as a bloc. This is an insight, in fact, that the Bush administration had, and they started something called the Major Economies Forum. And the good part about the Major Economies Forum is it keyed in on that thing. When it comes to mitigation of climate change, you only actually don't need 192 countries. You need just those 17, including the UN. The bad part of the Bush process was that they sort of insisted that the only way to get there was through largely voluntary measures, so that wasn't really helpful. But getting those 17 governments together was absolutely critical. Barack Obama restarted this process in April of this year, and there's been meetings of the Major Economies Forum every single month since then. And it's provided for exactly what you were suggesting, an opportunity for these countries to come together and talk to each other, metaphorically, face to face, right? And get some kind of agreements about the technology sharing issues, about the financing issues that are much more difficult to get in this bigger UN process. So, I sort of gave you sort of a slide there, or I gave you sort of an indication that in the UN process, 192 countries don't all speak individually. They speak in these gigantic voting blocs. The EU is a voting bloc. The OPEC countries are a voting bloc. And 130 other countries, sometimes including China, sometimes not, but also including those 5 other major emitters in the developing country, are all in the G77. And that makes, getting to an agreement much more difficult. And so what I sort of think is hopefully going to happen is that these smaller forums like the Major Economies Forum and then other sort of arenas like the G20 meeting, which we had in Pittsburgh in September, the G8, which happened in Italy in July, it will be out of those other forums that you'll begin to see the distillation of the bilateral agreements, the multilateral agreements, which will become really the basis for a new international treaty, which will be transparent and everyone will get to look at. And I think that's critically important.
We will have a book signing and invite you, queue up and buy a book and ask a question, or shortly we'll be across the street in the reception and you can definitely ask more questions then. But I see we're losing people who need to get to their next event. So before I close this event, I'd like to ask you all to thank you and thank our speaker for educating us so elegantly and so informatively about our topic. So thank you very much.